Maria Santos, a hard-working Mexican-American maid, endures daily humiliation from her wealthy employer, Richard Blackwood, at his luxurious Manhattan penthouse. During an elegant dinner party with influential guests, Richard decides to mock Maria's English accent for entertainment, not knowing she's fluent in multiple languages and holds a degree from Mexico City University. When Maria responds in perfect French, shocking the guests, it sets in motion a series of events that will completely transform both their lives and challenge everything Richard thought he knew about superiority and respect. As the elevator doors opened, with a soft chime on the 42nd floor of the prestigious Madison Avenue Tower, revealing Maria Santos as she stepped into the marble-floored hallway. Her worn sneakers squeaked slightly against the polished surface as she approached apartment 4201, fumbling with the heavy set of keys that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat over the past 2 years. At 28, Maria carried herself with a quiet dignity that her uniform, a simple grey dress with white trim, couldn't diminish. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, revealing tired eyes that held stories of long days and longer nights. She paused before the mahogany door, taking a deep breath as she always did before entering what felt like stepping into another world entirely. The penthouse sprawled before her like a museum of wealth and privilege. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Central Park, where the autumn leaves painted the landscape in brilliant oranges and reds. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across cream-colored walls, adorned with original paintings worth more than most people's homes. The scent of expensive leather furniture and fresh flowers filled the air, a stark contrast to the cramped studio apartment in Queens, where Maria returned each evening. "Maria, where have you been?" Richard Blackwood's voice cut through the silence like a blade. He emerged from his home office, adjusting his silk tie with the practiced motion of a man accustomed to commanding attention. At 52, Richard embodied the stereotype of old money: silver hair perfectly styled, Italian suit tailored to perfection, and an air of superiority that seemed to follow him like an expensive cologne. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood. The subway was delayed," Maria replied softly, her slight accent coloring her English words. She had learned long ago that explanations were rarely welcome, but silence often brought worse consequences. Richard's jaw tightened, his pale blue eyes narrowing with familiar disapproval. "I don't pay you to make excuses. I pay you to be here when I need you. Tonight is crucial. I'm hosting the Pemberton Foundation Board and everything must be perfect." "Do you understand what perfect means, Maria?" "Yes, sir, I understand." Maria set down her purse and immediately began her mental checklist. She knew Richard's definition of perfect: every surface gleaming, every glass spotless, every detail arranged to showcase his success to his equally wealthy peers. "The caterers will arrive at 4. Make sure you're invisible when the guests arrive at 7. I don't want them distracted by the help." His words carried the weight of unspoken prejudice, the kind that had followed Maria since she'd arrived in New York 5 years ago, with dreams of using her education degree and building a better life. As Richard disappeared back into his office, Maria began her familiar routine. She moved through the penthouse like a ghost, her presence acknowledged only when something wasn't quite right. The irony wasn't lost on her. She held a degree in international literature from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, spoke 4 languages fluently, and had once dreamed of becoming a translator for the United Nations. Instead, she scrubbed toilets and polished surfaces for a man who saw her as nothing more than an extension of his cleaning supplies. The morning dissolved into afternoon as Maria transformed the already immaculate penthouse into something that gleamed like a jewelry store display. She arranged white orchids in crystal vases, polished the grand piano until it reflected the chandelier above, and set up the bar cart with bottles of liquor that cost more than her monthly rent. Each task was performed with meticulous care, not out of pride for Richard's home, but from her own innate perfectionism, a trait that had earned her top honors in university but seemed worthless in her current circumstances. At precisely 4 o'clock, the caterers arrived with enough food to feed a small village. Maria coordinated their setup while remaining largely invisible, a skill she had perfected over 2 years of employment. The head caterer, a kind woman named Rosa, who reminded Maria of her mother back in Puebla, whispered words of encouragement in Spanish as they worked side by side. "Ten paciencia, mija," Rosa said softly, arranging canapés on silver platters. "These people, they think money makes them better than us. But we know better, don't we?" Maria nodded, grateful for the brief moment of solidarity. It was rare to find someone who understood the weight of being invisible in plain sight, of being essential yet entirely dismissed. As 6:30 approached, Richard emerged from his bedroom dressed in a tuxedo that probably cost more than Maria's entire wardrobe. He surveyed the penthouse with the critical eye of a general inspecting troops before battle. His gaze lingered on Maria, who was making final adjustments to the floral arrangements. "Remember," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of condescension, "you're to stay in the kitchen unless absolutely necessary. These are important people, Maria. They're not accustomed to people like you." The words stung, as they always did, but Maria had learned to swallow her pride like bitter medicine. She nodded obediently, watching as Richard adjusted his cufflinks with the satisfied smile of a man who believed he owned not just objects but people as well. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock, announcing the arrival of guests who would see only the surface of Richard's world. The gleaming success, the cultivated sophistication, the careful performance of a man who had forgotten that wealth without character was merely expensive emptiness. They would never see Maria, never know that the woman serving their drinks had read Cervantes in its original Spanish and could discuss philosophy in 3 languages. As Maria retreated to the kitchen, she caught her reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator. For just a moment, she saw not the invisible maid, but the woman she had once been, confident, educated, full of dreams that hadn't yet been ground down by daily humiliation. Tonight, she told herself, would be like all the others. She would serve, clean, and disappear until called upon again. She had no way of knowing that tonight would be different. Tonight, Richard Blackwood would make a mistake that would change everything, revealing not just his own character, but hers as well. The storm had been building silently for 2 years, and it was finally about to break. The penthouse filled with the carefully modulated voices of Manhattan's elite, each conversation a delicate dance of influence and ambition. Crystal glasses clinked against manicured fingernails as guests moved through Richard's domain like well-dressed sharks circling familiar waters. The Pemberton Foundation board members had arrived in their finest armor, designer gowns and $1,000 watches that served as badges of their social rank. Maria moved through the shadows of the kitchen, watching through the service window as Richard played his role to perfection. He stood near the fireplace, one hand casually resting on the marble mantel, regaling his guests with stories of his latest acquisition, a vineyard in Tuscany that he spoke of as if he'd personally pressed every grape. His laughter boomed across the room, the sound of a man intoxicated by his own importance. "Maria," Richard called sharply, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter, "bring out the champagne, the Dom Pérignon, not the Veuve Clicquot." She emerged from the kitchen carrying a silver tray laden with crystal flutes filled with golden champagne that cost more per bottle than she earned in a week. As she moved through the room, Maria became acutely aware of how the guests' eyes slid past her as if she were furniture, present but not worthy of acknowledgement. She had mastered the art of serving without being seen, a skill that had become both her protection and her prison. "Ah, perfect timing," Richard announced as Maria approached his circle of admirers. The group consisted of Eleanor Pemberton, the Foundation's elderly chairwoman, whose pearl necklace probably cost more than most people's cars, Dr. James Mitchell, a prominent surgeon whose philanthropy was as carefully calculated as his medical procedures, and Catherine Winters, a socialite whose influence in charity circles was matched only by her talent for cutting remarks disguised as compliments. "This champagne," Richard continued, accepting a glass from Maria's tray without so much as glancing in her direction, "is from a private reserve. Most people wouldn't appreciate the subtle notes of pear and brioche, but I'm sure your refined palates will detect the craftsmanship." Eleanor Pemberton sipped delicately, her weathered face brightening with approval. "Exquisite choice, Richard. You always did have impeccable taste." "It's all about understanding quality," Richard replied, his chest swelling with pride. "Speaking of which, I must apologize for any linguistic challenges you might encounter this evening. My housekeeper has a rather colorful way of butchering the English language." Maria's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she served Dr. Mitchell, but her face remained a mask of professional composure. She had heard variations of this joke before, but never in front of guests. The familiar shame began to rise in her throat like bile, but she swallowed it down along with her dignity. Catherine Winters laughed, a sound like expensive wind chimes in a hurricane. "Oh, Richard, you're terrible. But honestly, it is refreshing to find good help these days, even if the communication barriers can be amusing." "Exactly," Richard said, warming to his audience. "Just yesterday I asked her to dust the Monet in my study, and she spent 10 minutes asking me to repeat myself. I swear, sometimes I wonder if she's deliberately being obtuse." Dr. Mitchell chuckled, shaking his head with mock sympathy. "The struggles of the privileged class, eh, Richard? Having to explain simple instructions multiple times." Maria continued serving, her movements mechanical and precise even as each word landed like a physical blow. She thought of her mother, Elena, who had worked 3 jobs to put Maria through university, who had sewn late into the night to afford Maria's textbooks. She thought of her literature professors, who had praised her thesis on multilingual poetry, of the dreams she had carried across borders and through immigration offices. "You know," Richard continued, his voice growing louder as he noticed he had captured the attention of nearby guests, "I sometimes think I should provide her with English lessons, as a charitable gesture, of course, though I'm not sure she has the mental capacity to improve significantly." The group erupted in polite laughter, the kind that wealthy people used to signal their superiority over those they deemed less fortunate. Maria felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she maintained her composure, years of similar humiliations having taught her the value of silence. She retreated toward the kitchen, hoping to escape before Richard decided to elaborate further on her supposed deficiencies. But Richard wasn't finished, perhaps emboldened by the wine, or perhaps simply drunk on his own perceived cleverness. He called out across the room in a voice loud enough to ensure everyone could hear, "Maria, come back here for a moment." She turned slowly, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird. The entire room had fallen silent, 30 pairs of eyes now focused on the drama Richard was orchestrating for their entertainment. "Tell our guests how long you've been in America," Richard commanded, his smile sharp as a knife blade. "Use your best English now." Maria stood frozen in the center of the room, surrounded by faces that looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. She felt like an animal in a zoo, displayed for the amusement of visitors who would never understand what it meant to live behind the bars of prejudice and assumption. "5 years, sir," she replied quietly, her accent more pronounced under the stress of being the center of unwanted attention. "5 years," Richard repeated, as if this were the punchline to a particularly hilarious joke. "And listen to that pronunciation, 5 years. You'd think after half a decade one might make more progress with basic English sounds." The laughter that followed was like a chorus of hyenas, cruel and hungry. Maria felt something crack inside her chest, a sound like ice breaking on a frozen lake. For 2 years, she had endured this man's casual cruelty in private, but this public humiliation was a bridge too far. Catherine Winters leaned forward with predatory interest. "Perhaps she needs more practice with native speakers. Has she tried watching American television? I hear that helps with pronunciation." "Oh, I doubt she'd understand most of it," Richard replied, clearly enjoying his role as entertainer. "Complex vocabulary, you know. Cultural references that would go right over her head." The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement and additional suggestions, each guest eager to participate in the sport of mocking someone they saw as inherently inferior. Maria stood in the center of it all, her hands clenched at her sides, feeling the weight of every dream she had ever abandoned pressing down on her shoulders. Something was building inside her, a storm that had been gathering strength through months of small humiliations and years of being treated as less than human. The pressure was becoming unbearable, and Maria knew that very soon the dam would break. The laughter continued to ripple through the room like poison spreading through clear water. Maria stood motionless in the center of the penthouse, surrounded by faces that blurred together into a sea of cruel amusement. Her heart hammered against her ribs so forcefully she was certain everyone could hear it above their mocking chatter. Richard basked in the attention like a peacock displaying his plumage, clearly intoxicated by his captive audience's approval. He raised his champagne glass slightly, as if preparing to toast his own cleverness. "You see, ladies and gentlemen, this is what I mean about the help these days. Willing to work, certainly, but the language barrier creates such entertaining moments." Dr. Mitchell stepped forward, his medical training apparently not extending to diagnosing his own lack of empathy. "Have you considered enrolling her in ESL classes, Richard? Though I suppose at her age, language acquisition becomes significantly more challenging." "Her age?" Catherine Winters interjected with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "She can't be more than 30. Surely the brain is still plastic enough for basic English pronunciation at that point." Maria felt the familiar burn of tears threatening behind her eyes, but she had learned long ago that showing vulnerability only encouraged further cruelty. Instead, she focused on a spot on the wall just above Richard's head, trying to disappear into herself, the way she had mastered over 2 years of similar, though private, humiliations. Eleanor Pemberton, the Foundation chairwoman, pursed her lips with what might have been sympathy if it weren't so condescending. Perhaps we're being too harsh. I'm sure she does her best with her limitations. Not everyone can be blessed with proper education and cultural advantages. Exactly my point, Richard said, his voice growing louder with each passing moment. We must be understanding of those less fortunate, though I must admit sometimes I wonder if she truly comprehends even half of what I tell her to do. The circle of guests pressed closer, drawn by the spectacle like moths to a flame. Maria realized with growing horror that she had become their evening's entertainment, a living example of their own superiority. The weight of every sacrifice her mother had made, every late night she had spent studying, every dream she had carried across borders, seemed to crush down on her shoulders. "Maria," Richard called out again, his tone now openly mocking, "why don't you tell our guests about your hometown? Use simple words so we can all understand." The request hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown at her feet. Maria looked around the room at the expectant faces, each one waiting for her to perform her assigned role as their intellectual inferior. She saw Catherine Winter's predatory smile, Dr. Mitchell's clinical curiosity, Eleanor Pemberton's patronizing patience. But it was Richard's expression that cut deepest, the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he owned not just her labor, but her dignity as well. Something shifted inside Maria's chest, like tectonic plates grinding against each other before an earthquake. She thought of her literature professor, Dr. Ramirez, who had praised her thesis on code switching in contemporary Latin American poetry. She thought of the nights she had spent translating documents for immigrant families in Queens, helping them navigate bureaucratic labyrinths in 3 different languages. She thought of her mother's hands, scarred from years of sewing, who had whispered prayers over Maria's acceptance letter to university. "My hometown," Maria began, her voice barely above a whisper, "is Puebla." Richard leaned forward theatrically, cupping his ear. "Louder, Maria. Our guests can't hear your charming pronunciation." The condescension in his voice was the final spark that ignited the fire Maria had been suppressing for 2 years. She lifted her head, meeting Richard's eyes directly for the first time since she had begun working for him. When she spoke again, her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the room's ambient chatter like a blade through silk. "Je viens de Puebla," she said, the French flowing from her lips with the fluid precision of a native speaker. "Une ville magnifique avec une histoire riche que vous ne pourriez jamais comprendre, même si vous aviez l'intelligence nécessaire, ce qui, manifestement, n'est pas le cas." The effect was instantaneous and electric. The laughter died as if someone had thrown a switch, replaced by a silence so complete that the distant hum of the elevator shaft seemed thunderous. Every face in the room transformed from amused superiority to shocked confusion. Richard's champagne glass froze halfway to his lips, his eyes wide with something that might have been panic. Catherine Winters was the first to find her voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. Did she just speak French?" "Omni-fluent French," Eleanor Pemberton confirmed, her years of private education having given her enough linguistic training to recognize perfection when she heard it. "And unless my ears deceive me, she just delivered quite an eloquent insult." Dr. Mitchell stepped forward, his medical curiosity overriding his social discomfort. "What did you say?" he asked Maria directly, his tone completely different from the condescending amusement of moments before. Maria straightened her shoulders, feeling 2 years of suppressed dignity flowing back into her spine like water returning to a dry riverbed. When she spoke, it was in English so crisp and precise that it made Richard's earlier mockery seem even more pathetic in retrospect. "I said that I come from Puebla, a beautiful city with a rich history that you could never understand, even if you possessed the necessary intelligence, which clearly you do not." The silence that followed was deafening. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that they had been complicit in humiliating someone who was clearly more educated than they had assumed. Richard's face cycled through several shades of red, from embarrassment to anger, to something that looked almost like fear. "You," he started, then stopped, apparently realizing that any words he spoke would likely make his situation worse. Maria looked around the room, meeting each guest's eyes in turn. "I hold a degree in international literature from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. I speak Spanish, English, French, and Portuguese fluently. And for the past 2 years, I have cleaned your toilet while you mocked my intelligence." The words landed like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the comfortable assumptions that had allowed these people to feel superior. Maria saw recognition dawning on several faces, the uncomfortable realization that they had been the fools in this situation, not her. But she wasn't finished. 2 years of accumulated humiliation demanded more than just revelation. It demanded reckoning. The silence stretched across the penthouse like a taut wire, vibrating with tension that threatened to snap at any moment. Maria stood in the center of the room, no longer the invisible servant, but a woman transformed, her dignity restored and burning bright as a flame that had been forced underground but never extinguished. Richard's face had settled into a shade of crimson that matched the expensive wine he'd been serving, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The man who had built his identity on the foundation of his superiority over others suddenly found himself exposed as nothing more than a bully who had picked the wrong target. "This is," he stammered, his voice cracking with the weight of his crumbling composure. "This is completely inappropriate. You're just the help." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Maria watched as several guests visibly recoiled from their implications. Eleanor Pemberton, whose own immigrant grandparents had faced similar prejudice a century earlier, looked genuinely ashamed. Dr. Mitchell, who had taken an oath to do no harm, seemed to be reconsidering what harm actually meant. "Just the help," Maria repeated, her voice carrying a quiet strength that filled the enormous room. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood, I am the help. I help keep your home spotless, while you entertain guests who judge worth by bank accounts rather than character. I help maintain the illusion that you're a cultured gentleman, while you reveal yourself to be nothing more than a small, cruel man with inherited money and no earned wisdom." Catherine Winters, who had been silent since the revelation, finally found her voice. "Richard, perhaps we should—" "No," Maria interrupted, her years of being silenced finally coming to an end. "Let me finish. You want to know about my English, Mr. Blackwood? Let me demonstrate my grasp of your language." She turned to address the room, her posture straight and confident, every inch the educated woman she had always been beneath the uniform that had rendered her invisible. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have spent this evening laughing at what you perceived as linguistic deficiency, when in reality you were witnessing the code switching that occurs when someone educated in multiple languages adapts their speech patterns to navigate hostile environments." The academic terminology hit the room like a precision strike. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances, clearly out of their depth in a discussion that required actual intellectual engagement rather than inherited privilege. "My accent," Maria continued, "which you found so amusing, represents the intersection of Spanish phonological structures with English morphology, a phenomenon that occurs in all multilingual speakers and actually indicates cognitive flexibility that monolingual individuals often lack." Dr. Mitchell, despite his discomfort, couldn't hide his curiosity. "Where did you study linguistics?" "Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México," Maria replied, "ranked among the top universities in Latin America. My thesis examined code switching in contemporary Latino literature, specifically how authors like Gloria Anzaldúa and Juan Felipe Herrera use linguistic multiplicity as a tool of resistance against cultural hegemony." The academic credentials hung in the air like an indictment, making Richard's earlier mockery seem not just cruel, but pathetically ignorant. Eleanor Pemberton, whose foundation claimed to support educational initiatives, looked as if she wanted to disappear into the imported Italian marble beneath her feet. "This is ridiculous," Richard finally managed, his voice desperate and defensive. "I don't care what degrees you claim to have. You're in my home wearing a uniform I pay for, and you've been lying to me for 2 years. Maria's laugh was soft, but carried an edge sharp enough to cut glass. "Lying, Mr. Blackwood? You never asked about my education. You simply assumed that because I clean your home, I must be intellectually inferior. You created a fiction about who I am based on your prejudices, and when reality contradicts your comfortable assumptions, you accuse me of deception." She walked slowly around the room, no longer the hurried servant, but a woman commanding her space. "For 2 years, I have listened to you pontificate about literature you've never read, quote philosophers you don't understand, and discuss cultures you've never experienced. I've watched you perform intellectualism like a costume you put on for parties, while demonstrating the kind of ignorance that comes from confusing wealth with wisdom." Richard's hands were shaking now, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. You can't speak to me this way. I'll have you arrested for what? Maria asked, her voice dangerously calm. For speaking multiple languages, for having an education, for refusing to pretend I'm less intelligent than I am to protect your fragile ego. The room watched in fascination as the power dynamic that had seemed so fixed and immutable just minutes earlier completed its total reversal. Richard Blackwood, master of his domain, reduced to sputtering threats against a woman whose only crime had been existing while educated and Latina in his presence. Catherine Winters, perhaps sensing which way the wind was blowing, attempted to salvage something from the wreckage. Maria, I must say, your English is actually quite remarkable, and your French, where did you learn to speak so fluently? Alliance Française in Mexico City, Maria replied without missing a beat. I also spent a semester at the Sorbonne as an exchange student, but thank you for the validation. It means so much coming from someone who just spent 20 minutes laughing at my accent. The sarcasm was precise and surgical, leaving Catherine no room for graceful retreat. She flushed red and found sudden interest in her champagne glass. Eleanor Pemberton, to her credit, stepped forward with something resembling genuine remorse. Maria, I owe you an apology. We all do. What happened here tonight was inexcusable. What happened here tonight, Maria replied, was 2 years of accumulated cruelty finally meeting its consequences. Mr. Blackwood has spent our entire professional relationship treating me like an intellectually inferior being whose primary purpose was to validate his sense of superiority. Tonight, he decided to make that cruelty public for your entertainment. She paused, looking directly at Richard, whose face had gone from red to ashen. The tragedy isn't that you're ignorant, Mr. Blackwood. Ignorance can be educated. The tragedy is that you're cruel, and cruelty is a choice. Maria walked to the coat closet and retrieved her jacket, her movements deliberate and unhurried. When she turned back to the room, she was no longer Maria the maid, but Maria Santos, holder of a university degree, speaker of 4 languages, and a woman who had finally remembered her own worth. I quit, she said simply. And Mr. Blackwood, you might want to learn how to clean your own toilet. Something tells me you're going to have trouble finding help, willing to work for someone whose idea of sophisticated conversation is mocking the people who make his comfortable life possible. She walked toward the door, leaving behind a room full of people who would never again be able to pretend they didn't know the difference between ignorance and intelligence, between wealth and worth, between power and character. The elevator doors closed behind her with a soft chime, carrying her away from a world that had never deserved her grace, her patience, or her silent dignity in the face of their cruelty.